Hello and welcome to the podcast, Brian and Joey. Glad to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here, and we look forward to an interesting conversation.
Absolutely.
So you both just finished the book on Leadership Matters, Confronting the Hard Choices Facing Higher Education. And one of the things that interested me immediately when I read the book was a chapter, of course, called Accreditation, Athletic Conferences, and Beyond. What prompted you to collect those two very diverse topics into one chapter? And either one of you can go first.
Well, Joey, why don't you speak to it since you're the primary writer for this particular chapter?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You're right. I mean, it's not immediately obvious why you would put those together, but when you start thinking about accreditors and athletic conferences, as a college or university, they are really the two bodies that you deal with that are made up of your peers, that set up their own rules and that hold their members accountable to those rules. So they're very similar in a lot of ways. Both are governed as peer organizations. As a college president, you're generally aligned with both organizations as far as being involved, serving as a peer with other institutions, attending meetings, all those sorts of things. But really, I mean, they're very similar, and it is unusual, even amongst higher ed institutions, to have organizations that are peer-based that really hold their members accountable. That can sanction members, that can sanction them quite harshly, actually, and that is unique. I think it's a very higher ed centric model because I think higher education is comfortable with that model of allowing their peers to police them in that way. But to be an effective leader in the role, either as a president or as a senior staff member, understanding that that's the way they work, and that it's not that they're foisting their values on you. Their values are your values. I think we saw this quite a bit in discussions around NCAA Division I athletes and the way their scholarship model would work going forward. Many leaders acted as if they weren't a member of NCAA, but in fact, they were not only a member, they'd been involved in making the rules. So this is a very different kind of challenge as a leader, to be involved with an outside entity such as that. And they're very similar challenges. So, and they're not just challenges, they're also very similar in providing the positive benefits of having a group that holds you accountable to certain standards that everyone agrees are not only appropriate, but for the good of the institutions and for the good of the organizations.
I'd say, Karen, that these are important because you spend a lot of time there, and because they're expressions of your own sense of self, your own sense of the culture that is both internal and external. And in a sense, the accreditors allow you to think strategically about where you want to take that culture in terms of the accrediting, the regional accreditors. And the athletic teams really link the external and the internal constituencies so that it can reinforce the traditions and the culture that really best express the mission and scope of the institution that you serve.
So let's extend that topic a little bit and explain to our listeners the role and power that regional versus national accreditation has for each institution.
Well, I guess I'll start with that. Just a little history lesson. Regional accreditors were effectively invented by the Department of Education. So when the federal government decided to get into both heavily regulating education and also providing it substantial flows of money, it needed a way to assess whether a given institution was worthy effectively of those funds and was in compliance with federal laws. And it looked around. I mean, there was a discussion of doing it at the federal level, but there had already been several regional associations set up not as accreditors at that point, but as associations of institutions, particularly in the Southeast. And they were effectively repurposed regionally to effectively vet their own peer institutions. And it was thought, like we just discussed, that peer reviewers and peer institutions would make better judgments in regard to assessing those institutions. And effectively, that's the way it's been broken up since the federal government got into the higher ed business. National accreditors are a totally different animal. They typically are disciplinary based, things like nursing or accounting or whatever, and they look very specifically at discipline on campus. They have a lot of requirements typically that are specific only to that discipline. And while that can be very powerful from the standpoint of maintaining a high quality program, unlike a regional accreditor that's looking at the institution, this focus on a single discipline can really create some friction on campus in regard to what that means for other disciplines. John Lombardi, who's kind of a famously quotable college university president, has said, if they tell you need 3 starships, you better get 3 starships, and if that means you don't have a history department, so be it. And that is the difficulty of dealing with national accreditors. I think Brian has had some real experience with this at some of the institutions he's led.
I have, and I'll approach it in sort of to complement what Joey said. I'll approach it in a slightly different way. You're sitting there as the chair of the board of trustees, or maybe the college or university president, and you've got a charter and bylaws, and you've got to figure out how to maintain the sense of mission and the scope and scale of the institution in light of the charter and the bylaws. On the other hand, at the state level, as well as the federal level, you have legislators in particular, and often governors, who are interested in seeing, what's in it for me. That is, what's in it for the people of, picking on, since you're at Penn, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where I spent 20 years, what the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is getting in return for its dollars. Now, you're going to have to find a way to facilitate that discussion. And the only way you can facilitate it is not to become, in a decentralized system of American higher education, a centralized system of American higher education where you report directly to the governing bodies, but you have to find a way to mediate. And often what accreditors do is they mediate the discussion, and they also anticipate very often where the culture, the national political culture is headed. So that there is a focus, for example, in national accreditation and in regional accreditation, increasingly on things like strategy and on outputs, because there's anticipation as they mediate between and among the groups that that's where the political folks who control the dollars or Pell Grants and other kinds of levels of support are likely to push you. And therefore, if they can mediate that discussion, so much the better.
You mentioned Pennsylvania, of course. Pennsylvania is undergoing a PASHE examination.
Yes, it is.
6 schools are being merged down to 2, whatever those merger looks like. Accreditation plays a huge role in this. Do you have any comments about basically the accreditation is supposed to come up any day now, I think?
Well, I'd say it's a very complex situation in Pennsylvania. Before I was the president at Bucknell and at Washington and Jefferson, I was the head of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. My job basically was to say no to the expansionist tendencies of the state-related and the PASHE system. So I knew a lot about it because I was the guy who was the sort of counterbalancing effect in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has had a long sort of evolutionary history that is complex. If you look at the state-related, you understand the complexity. And I have to say, without the experiment being completed, that PASHE undertook what was a kind of revolutionary moment in the history of higher education. It decided not only to combine and condense some campuses, but to focus them in very particular ways. Now, I can't say that it's going to work, but I can say that there was innovation grafted on and experimentation grafted onto the way they usually did things that allowed them to define themselves in ways that are, in many respects, more focused and more specific than the state-related to the community colleges. And they deserve a good deal of credit for that.
Interesting. You write, the role of athletics must be shaped by campus culture and not by special relationships. Elaborate on what you mean. So many think it's just about prestige and history.
Joey, you wanted to start there?
Sure. I mean, clearly these athletic traditions have storied histories. We're arguing against that. But in the life of the typical undergraduate, and I think this is where you find a difference between alumni and trustees, and the typical undergraduate, they think about an institution that largely doesn't exist anymore. It's an institution that might be 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the typical undergraduate sees the institution in this 4-year window. And for them, athletics, is depending on the institution, is both an activity that they value greatly. There are many institutions now, particularly smaller institutions, that have a large number of student athletes as part of their makeup of their student body, and therefore that becomes a majority of activity on campus. And then, even at the largest institutions, it's a communal activity that brings the community together, focuses it on healthy competition, and that gives students something to fill their time. And that is kind of the way we think about it, because as college and university leaders, yes, you have to be very diligent about cultivating alumni and trustee views on athletics and what it does for the institution. But the reality when it comes to student life and the life of student athletes is very much about how it's embodied in the day-to-day and how you approach it from the leadership standpoint. And and that can be a broad range of things. I mean, we saw some institutions recently change their the structure of their daily class schedules. Something that seems pretty small, but going, for example, moving from say a 3-hour standard class to a 4-hour standard class. Some institutions have done that, and then even gone to smaller mini terms that allow for classes to only be taught in the morning. And more substantial blocks, leaving, of course, large blocks in the afternoon and evening for other activities. Let's be honest, a lot of that was to make athletics more easily fit within the schedule. When you try to space those classes out in labs all throughout the day, it really does put a press on time for athletics, or frankly any other performance, whether it could be theater or ballet or whatever. I mean, it all fits into that rubric. So I think that the campus leaders have become more flexible in their thinking about how to make the experience one that fits within the sort of mission and the way that this institution sees itself.
Interesting. Yeah.
The way I think, Karen, I'd respond to this is again, it complements what Joey's saying. But look, when you graduate from a college or university, what's your focus after graduation? Well, you may have a focus, you've had strong Greek life, you may have a focus on Greek relationships in terms of your ties to the institution. You may have a relationship with your academic department, but the tie that binds, if you will, is often athletics. And it varies. It varies between Division 1, 2, 3. I've served at Merrimack College in Massachusetts as the board chair, which is going Division 1. I've served as the chair of the Patriot League, which is Division 1 and a mid-major. And I've served Division 3 in the President's Athletic Conference out in Western Pennsylvania for W&J. And in each case, the campus culture meant something different. It played into athletics in a different way. Now, W&J played to a tie at the Rose Bowl in 1922, if I remember correctly. It's still there, very much present in the campus culture. Bucknell beat Kansas in 2005 in March Madness. That was my first year as president there, and I can tell you the impact that had on campus culture. And I think the danger sometimes is that because it's the tie that binds, particularly as you scale up to the sort of SEC style schools, it can be the sort of tail wagging the dog, in the sense that the culture can be overwhelmed by the athletic experience quite as much as the athletic experience shaped by the culture on the campus. And one has to constantly, as a president or board chair or provost, be thinking about that in terms of what you allow to shape in what kind of way. And I'll give you an example. You've decided that you cannot support, you choose your number, 25, 30 Division I sports, and that there are some, while all are important, you have a major fundraising campaign coming and you're the president. Is this the time necessarily to begin to cut out, as Stanford did, to cut out, I think it was 11 in Stanford's case, 11 Division I sports? Well, maybe you can do that if you're Stanford, but apart from the other 3 or 4 institutions in the country that would even have the courage to do that, whether it's a good idea or not, that's about as far as it goes, because you've got to factor in what the campus culture can tolerate strategically if you want to move it forward. And in some respects, athletics can shape or determine how far, or whether or not, in fact, you can even go that far as a college or university president if you want to change strategy.
Brian, building on what you just said, Jonathan Holloway, who's the, I think it's in his second year or third year at Rutgers, the president there, just made a remark to his faculty senate, which really struck me as being quite honest and direct. And he said, for too long, the entire Rutgers community has been laboring under the illusion that athletics will generate enough revenue to pay for itself, and then in turn, in time, turn a profit. Let me disabuse you of that claim. While I would be thrilled if athletics were to cover all of its expenses, it's highly unlikely that it will. Only 2% of major college athletics programs run in the black, and not many more than that break even. The better way to think about athletics is that it represents a commitment by the university that helps tell a compelling story about this institution, one that will inspire applicants, alumni, and friends to learn more about what we have to offer as a university in 2022. In this regard, the storytelling capability of athletics far outstrips any other thing that we do at Rutgers. Do you agree with this assessment? And is this how the role that athletics plays at that kind of institutional level?
Do you want me to go first, Joe, or did you want to?
I'll let you go first, Brian.
All right. You have to be careful what you tell as a compelling story. It's a compelling story about the quality of the research and the intimacy of the professor-student relationship that is being told by athletics? Or is it the story of athletics at the university that is being told by athletics? Now, I know we do these 30-second spot commercials on when you watch Saturday NCAA basketball, for example, whatever sport it is you're watching. But I don't necessarily think that there is a specific and intimate connection between athletics and academics in terms of the way athletics presents academics. We talk a lot, and I believe firmly in the concept of the student athlete. So in that sense, we get at it. But I don't necessarily, they're thinking about new neuroscience advances in terms of the 30-second spots they're putting in for the athletic programs of the Saturday afternoon shows, basketball games that you're watching, and I'll use basketball as the example. So I don't see it as a compelling argument. I do think he's right. In our first book, How to Run a College, I think we found that only one out of 8 Division I programs paid for itself. So the question then becomes, is it worth, in terms of stimulating the student faculty support for the university, and most particularly the donor and the, to some extent, the trustee, the donor, the trustee, and the alumni support, is it worth supporting athletics because it serves other ends at the university, like fundraising? And I think the way you'd have to determine that is to determine when major gifts are made through athletics, are they made largely to athletics or to increase the size of the library? And that's an open question. Joey?
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that's lost in that narrative about athletics, I don't care if it's at D1 or, a very small D3 school, there are very strong values that athletics has and can impart that are important to what we're trying to do as an institution. If you look at our mission and our charter, there are things like leadership, and there are certainly teamwork, all these sorts of things that we hope to accomplish at our institution that athletics does in mass and very effectively. you know, looking at athletics as if it's supposed to, I mean, how many other, let's be honest, how many other large scale programs on campus are looked at because for their ability to break even or support the budget? There are a lot of things that we do that are very costly, from remediating writing ability, which is more and more common as we see students coming out of high school not prepared to write or read at a college level. We do a substantial amount of remediation. We think that's important, and we know how costly it is. We think, you know, the things that we do in athletics are important, and that's why we do them. Can it drive an enrollment model? Absolutely. Brian and I have worked at institutions where it very much drove the enrollment model.
Hear, hear.
And that revenue was important to the institution, you know, not just because of what athletics did, but because it brought in the sort of students that we wanted to bring in. So I do think that it gets lost in sort of this, and I've worked at D1 institutions as well. It does get lost in this artificiality of the chasm between athletics and academics. And even at a D1 institution, let's face it, other than a handful of sports, though that chasm isn't even there. I mean, there are a lot of sports in D1 that are, you know, have some of the most talented students as far as scholarly students on campus. So it's not that those students don't exist in the D1 programs. I worked at Rice University. I can assure you those students exist in D1 programs.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll make a very quick point, Karen, because I wanted, Joey raised the point that I was only speaking about Division I schools. As somebody who represented a Division III school, if you have 120 players, male players on your football team, and you have a 65% rate, otherwise female to male ratio on campus, you can begin to redress, and rather dramatically, in a school of 1,000 or 1,200 students, your gender balance. Athletics can play all sorts of roles that aren't necessarily the sort of compelling interest roles in terms of pushing the academics forward. They are a bottom line consideration at many Division III schools.
Yeah, and I understand that. And one of the things that I've noticed, though, is that many Division III schools that do have football are struggling with their Title IX prong one, if you will. So the other mechanisms of becoming into compliance with Title IX become prong two, which is a history and continuing opportunity of expanding opportunities for the underrepresented gender, or three, that you've basically offered everything you can possibly consider offering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's tough because there's more women than men going to college right now. But football plays such a central role on so many small college campuses for campus spirit and alumni and homecoming and those kinds of things. Any thoughts on those? Joey, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, it's really the double whammy of football and men's baseball.
Yeah.
On a small campus. I mean,
or lacrosse or men's lacrosse. Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, if you look at those two, it is really hard with female sports to balance that out, or with female activities in general, because you can go to those other prongs. But I mean, even if you added everything that you can think of, it's on a numbers basis, it's very, very difficult. And I think that both the federal government and the athletic associations are looking for intent, right? You're trying to make that equity balance, but it becomes a very difficult situation.
It's both an addition and a subtraction problem too. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that presidents can get into trouble if they decide to begin to subtract sports from their campus to come into Title IX compliance.
Right.
I know of one example where one, and I probably shouldn't name names because these folks are friends, one individual often offered to dredge a river so the crew team could continue playing.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
What do you say?
Yeah, it's an interesting business that we're in when it comes to these kinds of things. There's no doubt about it.
It is, Karen.
So in the book, you have a lot to say about the previous restrictions on names, image, and likenesses. You were pretty adamant that the NCAA was doing something entirely unethical by restricting athletes from leveraging their NIL. So how's it going now? What do you think about where we are?
Joey, I think this is a question for you, and I hope you use the Princeton example that you and I talk about from time to time.
I surely will. I mean,
All right.
our favorite example is when Brooke Shields went to Princeton and took a scholarship. They did not claim to own her NIL. And you can look at this at graduate students who get a lot of aid from institutions. They don't typically say we own everything. We most don't even say we own your intellectual property, much less your name, image, and likeness. So the hypocrisy, and I understand how we went down this road. It started with licensing and then with video games and all these things. Nobody had ever really thought about it. And they never thought it would be worth as much as it ended up being worth. But there was a point at which it was ludicrous in a student athlete model to be making those kind of revenues and claim that you had the right to do so. And I think that there has been great progress, actually. I actually think in NCAA D1, there has been great progress in general in the last few years, as they've stopped saying they're going to struggle with these problems and they're actually going to do something about them.
Interesting. Brian, your thoughts?
I think I'll just echo what Joey said. Now's the time to act. The sort of Pandora's box it's open, and so now they have to figure out how to solve the problem. I think that the Brooke Shields example is a very good example, not because it's an actress or an actor, but because it illustrates, in fact, that has to be a consistency in the approach.
Yeah. So speaking of now is the time, each division 1, 2, and 3 is hard at work trying to assemble a new constitution that works for everyone. No small task. What suggestions do you both have for the working groups?
Okay. Joey, you want to start or do you want me to?
I'll start, I guess.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I really think that there needs, to try to come up with a consistent model that stretches across scholarship and non-scholarship is probably a Sisyphean task, honestly. They're really very different. So I think divisions 1 and 2 need to work together to come up with a very uniform application of athletic scholarships. Division 3 has been exceedingly consistent in comparison on their side. So when you look at division 1 and 2, there really is a balancing act. And it's not just about who gets the revenue. It's about what's good for the students, right? The student is the first word in that student athlete model. And, it probably wouldn't be healthy if they were making $600,000 a year off of those rights. Alternately, it's probably not healthy when they leave without a degree to pursue a professional career without anything to fall back on. So I think it's all about that balance, but I think they're entering into it with the right approach, which is we're going to come up with a uniform model that we can get complete consistency, whether it be the SEC or the smallest D2 conference anyone's ever heard of. And I think that is appropriate. In a way, they can look to D3 for that, of having an absolutely consistent model that doesn't waver.
Interesting.
I'd say, basic question, what's a scholar athlete? You have to start by asking, what is it you're trying to do? I think this is a tremendous, like Joey, I think this is a tremendous opportunity for athletics, college and university-based athletics, to begin the sort of, everything's out of the bag now, to begin to have a conversation. But I think each of the various divisions, if they're constituted in the same way at the end of it, has to look at purpose, mission, scope, and scale. Because playing for the University of Alabama and playing for choose Emory and Henry College, it's just a different. It's different. It's different in terms of what the culture expects. It's different in terms of what the culture can and will support. And it's different in terms of how we, the American public, perceive the institution. What I'd also say is whatever happens in the Constitution, it should go back and reflect the mission of like-minded institutions. Mm-hmm. It should be consistent, not only with where the puck is likely to be, but it should also be consistent with the history and traditions. I'm a historian by training. You do not want to throw the history and traditions aside as you craft something new for the 21st century, because that would be a profound mistake.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Joey, Lyon is just announced you're leaving the NAIA and transitioning to Division III. This is a big deal in a lot of respects, but crucial in that you are moving from awarding athletic scholarships, I assume, to not having any athletic scholarships. Help our listeners understand this decision.
Well, I resigned from Lyon last year, so I can probably be a little more open in my answer to that. Just knowing that this is not me talking on behalf of the institution. But I mean, it was certainly an open discussion and a pretty heated one at times, as you can imagine. But Lyon is a small is recognized as a national liberal arts college. It's on the small end of that spectrum with about 650 students, and so it sees its peer institutions as other liberal arts colleges. And I think that's a big part of it. The NAI conference it was playing in, and let's look at the historical connection there. Why was it an NAI? Why did it have athletic scholarships? Because for the longest time, athletics at Lyon was male and female basketball. That was it. And so you had 12 person squad on each side, and you were NAI because NAI was a basketball conference. And so historically, it made all the sense in the world. And when you're talking about, a couple of handfuls of student athletes just playing basketball, you don't worry about how you're scholarshiping. And because, I mean, honestly, you're doing it the way everyone else is. And it's such a small part of your campus life and, your student body that it's not as big of an issue. As athletics became a much bigger part of Lyon's conception of itself, and becoming an institution with more than 50% of students as student athletes, that's very different. Now you have a dozen male and female sports. You have a large part of your budget thinking about how you're going to utilize athletics, and you're really playing with a group of schools that probably you wouldn't consider as peer institutions in regard to your mission. And that's not to be a negative comment, it's just true. And so I think that there was a thinking that we would be better off as an institution playing with schools that were more like us, and sort of competing in that market. And then also the question of how you would award scholarships as an institution. And when literally athletic scholarships become your dominant form of scholarship, kind of just organically, and you start to think about, was this really emphasizing the values of what we're trying to do here? And it's not that there won't be a fairly significant scholarship model. It just won't be an athletic scholarship model once the shift is made. There'll be things like leadership scholarships and sportsman, and all these things that you can build around a non-scholarship model. You look at discounting, and that's of course the way we look at it as higher ed leaders. The discounting will be very similar. It wasn't done as a discounting maneuver to try to make more net revenue. I think it was predominantly done philosophically. And that's probably the right way to approach it, because philosophically, you're thinking about your mission, and you're thinking about your vision and your charter, and you're making decisions based on those things. And while they may not be popular, and I suspect, but I don't know this, I'm no longer there, but I suspect that there has been some alumni pushback and some former scholarship athletes who think that this is not the best idea. But I think that the institution, the faculty, the coaching staff, and the trustees and the leadership all came together and thought that this was the right thing for the institution going forward.
It makes sense, having been a part of the NAIA and understanding how that transition. There also just seem to be more opportunities for postseason events in Division III than there is in the NAIA. There just seem to be a broader range of opportunities. Did that strike you as important as well?
That did. And the other thing that happened during this whole process of this conversation is NAIA collapsed its two divisions into one. So that exacerbated the problem of the differing types of institutions. And yes, there were the considerations of postseason play. There were the considerations of travel. If you think gerrymandering is bad in elections, look at the way some of these conferences are designed. I mean, they're just not ideal. And that's another thing. I mean, historically, there was an Arkansas athletic conference that was NAI, and then all the schools were in, and it made all sorts of sense. But that's long a thing of the past. And now I think there was a sense that you could get a geographic conference that would allow you to spend less time traveling and, of course, less money. But it's really the time that's so precious with these students.
Absolutely.
And so, that was those were all factors. I mean, and it's hard to balance that out. And it will be no easy transition. I mean, NCAA is not an easy transition. At best, it's 3 years. It's more likely 5, depending on how you approach it. Either way, that is a very arduous process.
It is. I've led an institution from no affiliation into Division III, so I know exactly what you were thinking about there. Gentlemen, my last question for you is, you conclude in the book a frank assessment of what colleges need to do to face the future. What are some of your observations about that, and what should we do? Brian,
Well, Joey, I think Joey would make me, since although he wrote the accreditation chapter, I wrote the concluding chapter, so he expects me to remember what I wrote, I think, since he agreed with it. I think the first thing I'd say is that this book is really for trustees and others, but certainly for trustees. It's an effort to assert the role of leadership within a changing set of circumstances that were exacerbated. We call it the third inflection point, exacerbated both by the Great Recession and by the COVID pandemic and its aftermath now. So the first thing I think we have to do is we have to recognize that, in fact, COVID has fairly dramatically, and the Great Recession have fairly dramatically changed the relationship of the college or the university to its environment. That is also exacerbated by the fact that there is a demographic crash coming, that consumer preferences have changed, that endowments are fine when you have them, but they're largely restricted, and that there is a significant amount of crushing debt level in college and university situations right now that they have to face. So the argument that I think we make is an important one because it goes to the heart of governance. And what we argue is that governance is the three-legged stool. We support it, but that in fact, you really have to begin to think carefully about who you place in leadership roles within governance. And I'll look quickly at 3 examples. In the first example, be careful who you choose as president. We argue that there are 3 types of presidents, and the argument that the conclusion we come to is the president best suited as we move into the second quarter of the 21st century is likely to be the strategist, not the presider president, and not the bull in the china shop. And you have to think about in a rapidly changing world that is governed by technology you can't even envision, how you begin to shape and to factor the set of circumstances that allow you to remain true to mission and yet also prepared to be creative enough to anticipate, again, as I said before, where the puck is going to head. For board chairs, we argue the trustees are the weakest of the 3 legs. And then for board chairs, you have to begin to sort of shepherd your resources. You have to begin to work as a teammate. You have to understand the role of the board chair, and most important, what she or he does not do. And because there is a tendency to assume administrative duties when it isn't appropriate. For the faculty, we think the best way to think about governance for the faculty is to have them focus on what faculty do. They're the keepers of the flame who protect the academic enterprise. And what we found in the leadership, as we thought about leadership, is that the best faculty leaders will be seasoned individuals who understand that, in fact, the academic core of the college or university is, in fact, the thing that they should safeguard jealously, and they should also protect and nurture. Now, what that means also is that there are 2 aspects, and you're at University of Pennsylvania, so you'd understand this perfectly, I think. There are 2 things about in any situation. The joke about Penn is it's a large real estate holding. It is both an academic enterprise, but it is also an economic powerhouse in the region, in the nation, and that's true depending upon the size and scale of the institution and any institution across the country. The economic engine aspect of this makes colleges and universities important in two ways, both because they keep the academic integrity and the cultural history in place for this generation and for future generations, and also they are the economic powerhouses that transform cities like the one I grew up near, Boston. And if you know the Boston of the 1960s and 70s, and you know the Boston I just visited last week in a speech in 2022, they're in very different places. You still recognize it, but the function and purpose is different, and it was fueled by the economic weight of the colleges and universities and hospitals and the biotech initiatives in the region. The last point I'd make is that, and Joey, I think you'll support me here, is that higher education has to think about how it becomes more relevant. It's lost and is losing the sort of public relations value of the battle, rather, over the value of American higher education. And that's where leadership matters, because if board chairs and presidents and faculty heads and provosts and all of the other folks who constitute the constituency upon which leadership is based understand their role, then they have to understand that they need to be able to make certain that higher education remains relevant in a society that increasingly it is largely helping to shape.
Joey, your thoughts?
Well, I echo those thoughts. I don't think, I don't think that we're entering the easiest period for higher education. When we talk about these inflection points, the other two were the long depression following the Civil War and the Great Depression. We think it's that sort of challenging moment. And we're also facing a challenging moment for our country and the world. I mean, I think in the last couple of weeks, we've seen that very clearly. Democratic values are being challenged. And for colleges and universities in a democratic society, we're called upon to lead that conversation. And I know that many of our colleagues are reticent because that is not a popular conversation to it's not a popular conversation to have, much less to lead. But that is clearly the role of these institutions. And so, I think that in a very challenging time, there are challenges, both domestic and international, that lead us to have to be probably quite a bit more. Well, I think there's a certain amount of bravery required. There's a certain amount of putting yourself into that breach and saying, we need to have this conversation. We think it's important in our creation of citizens, which is embodied in almost every college or university mission. And we're equal to that task. So it's not just about getting your institution through a difficult enrollment period. It's about getting it through a difficult enrollment period with a lot of other very difficult things happening. And I think that it's going to call upon leadership more than it has in generations. And so the work you do at Penn GSE is critically important during this period because when you go between 70 and 90 years between these inflection points, there aren't any leaders left over. And so every time they're born out of the crucible of what we're dealing with. And I think that's what is happening right now and will be happening for the rest of my career in higher ed.
So well said, both of you. And you've really given me and hopefully my listeners a lot to think about the important role that while we can get lost in the minutia of March Madness and athletics, that the bigger picture of higher ed is about having an inclusive environment that allows our future leaders to grow and to thrive and to think. And I think that's something that I've really enjoyed and heard loudly from the two of you, writing partners, thought partners in this process. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. It was fun actually to sort of spend some time with Joey. We still remain friends after 2 books together.
That's good.
And you can tell we clearly like talking about this. So we appreciate your inviting us.
I can tell. Thank you both.
Thank you, Karen.